Failure doesn't feel like a lesson when you're inside it. It feels like embarrassment, like loss, like proof that you're not enough. But what if that feeling isn't there to break you? What if it's there to teach you something you've been avoiding? Most people don't fail because they're incapable. They fail because they refuse to look honestly at what went wrong, and that refusal costs them years. Number one, failure is feedback, not a final verdict. Most people hear the word failure and immediately attach meaning to it that goes far beyond what actually happened. They treat it like a permanent label, a judgment on their worth, intelligence, or future. But failure itself is neutral. It is simply an outcome that did not match your expectation. The damage doesn't come from failing, it comes from the story you tell yourself afterward. When you decide that one setback defines who you are, you stop thinking clearly. You stop experimenting, adjusting, and learning. You freeze, not because you can't move forward, but because you've mistaken information for identity. Feedback is valuable because it shows you reality without filters. It reveals where your assumptions were wrong, where your preparation was insufficient, or where your behavior didn't align with your goals. In that sense, failure is more honest than success. Success often hides weaknesses because results can temporarily mask poor foundations. Failure exposes those weaknesses immediately. It forces you to confront what didn't work instead of allowing you to live comfortably inside false confidence. If you can view failure as data rather than condemnation, you gain access to insights that most people miss simply because they're too busy protecting their ego. The problem is that ego wants comfort, not clarity. It would rather explain failure away than analyze it. Blame circumstances, blame other people, blame timing, blame anything that keeps self-image intact. But every excuse delays growth. When you refuse to see failure as feedback, you repeat the same patterns with more frustration and less hope each time. Patterns don't break themselves. They require awareness, and awareness begins with honesty about what actually happened, not what you wish had happened. Seeing failure as feedback also shifts how you approach effort. Instead of trying once and expecting perfection, you begin to think in iterations. You test, observe, adjust, and try again. This mindset builds resilience because setbacks no longer feel catastrophic. They feel informative. Each failure narrows the gap between where you are and where you want to be by showing you what needs to change. Progress becomes a process instead of a performance, and pressure gives way to responsibility. When you internalize that failure is not a final verdict, you stop fearing it and start using it. You become more willing to take meaningful risks, to stretch beyond what feels safe, and to engage with challenges that actually demand growth. You learn to separate self-worth from outcomes and focus instead on skill, discipline, and adaptation. Over time, this perspective doesn't just change how you respond to failure, it changes how you approach life itself. Number two, avoiding failure keeps you weak and stagnant because it traps you inside a narrow version of life where safety is prioritized over growth. When your main goal becomes not failing, your decisions shrink. You choose what feels familiar instead of what challenges you. You stay where you are competent enough to avoid embarrassment, but never uncomfortable enough to improve. This creates the illusion of stability while quietly eroding your potential. Over time, you become skilled at avoiding risk, not at building strength, and that trade-off is far more costly than most people realize. Strength is not developed in environments where nothing is at stake. It is built through exposure to difficulty, uncertainty, and the possibility of loss. When you avoid failure, you also avoid the conditions that force adaptation. You don't test your limits, so you never discover where they actually are. Instead of learning how to recover, you focus on how to stay hidden. This makes you fragile. The moment life forces change upon you, and it always does, you are unprepared because you've spent years rehearsing comfort rather than resilience. Avoidance also distorts your perception of progress. You may appear functional on the surface, but internally there is stagnation. The same problems repeat because nothing new is being attempted. The same fears remain because they've never been confronted. Avoiding failure doesn't eliminate fear, it strengthens it. Each time you step back from a challenge, you reinforce the belief that you couldn't handle it anyway. That belief slowly hardens into identity, and once fear becomes part of how you see yourself, it quietly dictates your choices. Stagnation often feels calm at first, but it carries a hidden psychological cost. There is a deep dissatisfaction that comes from knowing you are capable of more, but choosing less. That dissatisfaction doesn't disappear. It turns into frustration, resentment, and self-doubt. People begin to envy those who take risks, not because those people always succeed, but because they are moving forward. Movement matters. Even failure creates momentum because it forces reflection and change, while avoidance leaves everything exactly where it is. When you allow yourself to fail, you gain something far more valuable than short-term comfort. You gain experience. You learn how to respond when things don't go your way. You develop emotional strength by surviving disappointment instead of running from it. Each failure becomes proof that you can endure difficulty and continue anyway. That proof builds confidence, grounded in reality, not fantasy. Avoiding failure may protect your ego in the moment, but it weakens your character over time, keeping you trapped in the same place while life quietly moves on. Number 3, responsibility turns pain into progress because it forces you to engage with reality instead of escaping from it. Pain, by itself, is just suffering. It feels heavy, disorienting, and often unfair. When something goes wrong, the instinct is to look for someone or something to blame so the discomfort eases, even temporarily. But blame only numbs the pain, it doesn't transform it. Responsibility, on the other hand, asks you to stand still long enough to ask what role you played, what choices led here, and what can be done differently next time. That shift changes pain from something that happens to you into something you can work with. Taking responsibility does not mean attacking yourself or carrying guilt endlessly. It means accepting that your actions, habits, and decisions matter. That acceptance is empowering, even though it doesn't feel that way at first. Pain becomes meaningful when it points to something within your control. The moment you say, "This is my responsibility," you regain agency. You move from being passive to being active. Without responsibility, pain stays chaotic. With responsibility, pain becomes structured, something you can analyze, understand, and eventually reduce through better choices. Progress requires clarity, and responsibility provides that clarity. When you avoid responsibility, everything remains vague. The reasons for failure are external, unclear, and unchangeable. But when you accept responsibility, the picture sharpens. You see patterns in your behavior, weaknesses in your preparation, and moments where you chose comfort over discipline. That clarity can be uncomfortable, but it is also precise. Precision is what allows improvement. You cannot fix what you refuse to name, and responsibility is the act of naming the truth without distortion. There is also a psychological shift that happens when responsibility becomes your default response. Pain stops feeling pointless. Instead of asking why something happened to you, you begin asking what it is asking of you. That question reframes struggle as instruction rather than punishment. Each painful experience becomes a lesson in boundaries, effort, or awareness. Over time, this builds resilience because you stop collapsing under difficulty and start using it as material for growth. Responsibility also builds self-respect. When you face pain honestly and take ownership of your role in it, you prove to yourself that you are capable of change. That proof matters more than motivation or reassurance from others. It creates trust in your own ability to respond to hardship with maturity rather than avoidance. Progress is rarely dramatic. It is quiet and incremental, built through repeated acts of responsibility in moments where excuses would be easier. Pain is unavoidable in life, but progress is optional, and responsibility is the mechanism that connects the two. Number 4, repetition without reflection is self-sabotage, because doing the same thing over and over while expecting a different result is not discipline, it is avoidance. Many people mistake consistency for progress, believing that sheer effort will eventually fix what is fundamentally flawed. But effort applied blindly only reinforces existing mistakes. When actions are repeated without evaluation, errors become habits, and habits quietly shape outcomes. What feels like persistence can actually be stagnation disguised as hard work. Reflection is what gives repetition its value. Without it, repetition only strengthens patterns that may already be holding you back. You can show up every day, work long hours, and stay busy, yet still remain stuck if you never pause to ask what is working and what is not. This is uncomfortable because reflection demands honesty. It forces you to admit that your approach might be wrong, that your assumptions might be incomplete, or that your skills need refinement. Avoiding reflection protects the ego but undermines growth. Self-sabotage often looks responsible on the surface. You tell yourself you are trying, that you are consistent, that you are doing your best. But beneath that narrative, there is resistance to change. Repeating familiar behaviors feels safe, even when they produce poor results. Change requires vulnerability because it involves letting go of certainty. Reflection exposes gaps in competence and judgment, and facing those gaps can be unsettling. Yet ignoring them guarantees that the same failures will repeat with increasing frustration. When reflection is absent, repetition drains motivation. Each unsuccessful attempt feels heavier than the last because there is no sense of learning. You begin to doubt yourself, not because you lack ability, but because you lack direction. Progress depends on feedback loops. Action produces results, results are evaluated, and adjustments are made. Remove evaluation from that cycle, and effort becomes meaningless. Reflection turns experience into insight, and insight is what allows improvement to compound over time. There is also a deeper psychological cost to unexamined repetition. It trains you to ignore signals that something needs to change. You become disconnected from reality, clinging to routines instead of responding to outcomes. Over time, this erodes trust in your own judgment. True discipline includes the willingness to stop, think, and course correct. It is not rigid loyalty to a failing strategy, but commitment to growth. Repetition guided by reflection builds skill, confidence, and clarity, while repetition without it quietly works against you, reinforcing the very limitations you are trying to overcome. Number 5. Strength is built by facing what went wrong because growth does not come from pretending everything is fine when it clearly is not. When something fails, whether it is a relationship, a goal, or a personal standard you didn't live up to, there is an immediate temptation to move past it as quickly as possible. People distract themselves, reframe the situation to protect their pride, or blame external factors so they don't have to sit with discomfort. But avoidance does not remove the damage. It only delays understanding it. Strength requires the courage to slow down and look directly at what failed, without excuses and without self-deception. Facing what went wrong means examining your actions honestly. It means asking questions that are uncomfortable and specific. Where did I cut corners? What did I ignore because it was inconvenient? What warning signs did I dismiss because acknowledging them would have required change? This kind of reflection is mentally demanding because it strips away the narratives that make you feel innocent or unlucky. Yet this process is exactly what builds strength. You develop the ability to tolerate truth, and tolerance for truth is a form of psychological endurance that most people never train. There is also a practical aspect to this kind of confrontation. When you face what went wrong, you gain usable information. You stop guessing and start understanding. Strength is not blind confidence. It is competence built through correction. Each honest assessment refines your judgment and improves your future decisions. Instead of repeating the same mistakes with more frustration, you adjust your approach with more precision. This is how experience becomes wisdom rather than just time passing. Facing failure also builds emotional strength. It teaches you that discomfort is survivable. When you don't collapse under self-criticism or denial, you learn that negative emotions are signals, not threats. You become less reactive and more thoughtful. Over time, this emotional steadiness becomes a source of confidence that doesn't depend on constant success. You trust yourself not because you always get things right, but because you know you can handle being wrong and respond intelligently. Avoiding what went wrong keeps you fragile because fragility depends on ignorance. The less you know about your weaknesses, the more dangerous they become. When you face them directly, they lose some of their power. Strength grows in that space between failure and honesty, where you choose responsibility over comfort and understanding over illusion. Each time you confront what went wrong without flinching, you reinforce the belief that you are capable of learning, adapting, and continuing forward even when the outcome is not what you hoped for. Number 6. Growth begins the moment excuses end because excuses are the mental shortcuts that keep you exactly where you are. They soften the impact of failure and protect your self-image, but they also block learning. When you rely on excuses, you trade short-term emotional comfort for long-term stagnation. Each excuse becomes a reason not to change, not to adapt, and not to take responsibility. Over time, this habit shapes how you see yourself, not as someone capable of growth, but as someone at the mercy of circumstances. Excuses feel convincing because they are often partially true. Timing really was bad. Other people really did make things harder. The situation really was unfair. But partial truth can still be deeply misleading. When you focus only on what was out of your control, you ignore what was within it. Growth does not require perfect conditions. It requires honest assessment. The moment you stop asking who or what to blame and start asking what you can do differently, your attention shifts from defense to development. Ending excuses is uncomfortable because it removes emotional padding. You are left with the raw reality of your choices and their consequences. This can feel harsh at first, but clarity is not cruelty. Clarity is necessary for improvement. Without it, your efforts remain scattered and ineffective. When excuses disappear, patterns become visible. You begin to see where you consistently avoid effort, where discipline breaks down, and where fear disguises itself as logic. That awareness is the foundation of real change. Growth also accelerates when excuses end because energy stops being wasted. Defending your past choices takes mental effort. Justifying inaction drains focus. Once that energy is redirected toward problem solving, progress becomes possible. You stop waiting for motivation or validation and start building systems, habits, and skills. Growth becomes practical rather than emotional. It is no longer about feeling ready, but about acting responsibly even when readiness is absent. There is a deeper psychological shift that happens when excuses no longer dominate your thinking. You regain a sense of agency. Life stops feeling like something that happens to you and starts feeling like something you participate in. This sense of agency strengthens self-respect because you are no longer hiding from your potential. You may still fail, and setbacks will still happen, but they no longer trap you in explanation. Each challenge becomes an opportunity to adjust rather than a reason to retreat. Growth is not a sudden transformation. It is the steady result of choosing honesty over comfort, responsibility over relief, and action over justification. Failure is not the enemy. Avoidance is. Every setback is an invitation to take responsibility, learn, and grow stronger. When excuses end, progress begins, and strength follows honesty. Face what went wrong and let it shape who you become rather than stop you.